Unabashed.
The most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives,
a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan and Tanvi of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Since the end of the Cold War, it has become commonplace to view America's relationship with India through the prism of China. The argument goes something like this. The United States needs a strong, prosperous, and democratic India to act as a hedge against China. And India, in turn, requires development, diplomatic, and defense cooperation from the United States in order to keep the Chinese threat at bay. But a new book by the scholar Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution argues that China's centrality to U.S. India relations is hardly a product of the past few decades. Tanvi's new book is called Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped U.S. India Relations During the Cold War, and it offers a historically grounded yet readable guide to the ways in which China has influenced the trajectory of U.S. India ties, both directly and indirectly, since India's independence in 1947. Podcast listeners know Tanvi from her regular spot at this table for our monthly news roundups, but it's a pleasure to welcome her back here today to talk about her brand new book. Tanvi, welcome back and congratulations.
Thank you, Milan, and thank you for all the support and hand-holding as I've finished writing this book, and I'm helping me think about how to promote it.
Yeah, we will, and promote it we will. I just want to say for the record that you had your book launch at Brookings like 2 weeks ago, I think it was?
I did. I think it was just last week, but because of the Trump trip, this whole week has seemed like a month.
Every day is a year.
Yeah.
So I arrived right when it started at 10 a.m., and there was not a single free seat in the house. I had the coveted spot in between the decaf coffee and the water cooler. So that's a sign, I guess, of interest in Washington in your book. So congratulations on that.
Thanks, Milan. I mean, what was nice about that as well is one of the things I wanted to do with this book is not just have folks who, look at India or U.S. India relations, but one of the things the book does is to put the U.S.-India relationship back in an Asian context. And so it was nice to see at the book launch a lot of folks there who work on, not just on India, but, who think about the broader Asian region as well.
So I want to come back to that. But before I do, every book, particularly one of this breadth and depth and length, has an intriguing backstory. So I want to ask you about yours. You were sitting there in the LBJ library at the University of Texas, Austin. You were going about doing your PhD, and you had this eureka moment, light bulb went off. Tell us about the moment that this book kind of came into view.
So I went into this, researching this book, not thinking about China at all. I was, thinking about how do I, don't we know about U.S.-India relations? New archives had opened up in India. More archives and papers were available in the U.S. because the number of presidential papers had become available since the last tranche of U.S.-India books had been written. So my curiosity was, what was driving the U.S.-India relationship in the past, and were the things that we were missing that explained why the two countries did engage, and they weren't just estranged during that Cold War period. So as I was sitting in the Johnson Library, I expected to see what we usually think of as major factors in the relationship. U.S.-India differences on Pakistan or the Soviet Union coming into these discussions in the files, and the U.S. seeing India either through a Pakistan prism or a Soviet prism. What I ended up seeing, though, is a lot of people, officials, but also Johnson himself, very focused on seeing India through a China prism. They were comparing what was happening in India and China. And there were these kind of couple of things that struck me. The two instances that I'll give you is, during the course of the 1965 India-Pakistan war, which obviously happened during the Johnson administration, I started seeing these operational plans, which were U.S. operational plans in these documents, of what to do, how the U.S. would intervene in that war on India's behalf if China intervened.
These are kind of military blueprints.
Military documents, yeah. And they were in the NSC files, the National Security Council files, because Johnson had asked then Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, and they'd both discussed actually, kind of coming to India's defense if China intervened. Now, this was something I didn't know anything about, had never heard this, and also made me think, we thought the U.S. and India worked together in the 1962 war, but this was clearly 3 years later.
Right.
But the second document was, and that's something kind of that I've tried to kind of keep in the book, is not just look at defense security, was these rainfall maps and rainfall amount figures for India that these senior NSC officials had in these files and were kind of talking about. And it was because from Johnson on down, they were trying to keep track of Indian agriculture and economic performance. And then they even had, like the US and India had this joint project called Project GrowMet, which I kept reading as Grommet. Then I realized, GrowMet means they were seeding rain. They were actually trying to cause rain to help India economically grow and match China's development. And so, these things kind of intrigued me that these guys were thinking so much about China. Let me go and actually see if this China element played out in other administrations in the US, but also was India thinking about the U.S. in context of its China relationship at all?
So you kind of anticipated where I was going, but let me kind of reframe the question in the following way. The conventional ways, you said, of viewing U.S.-India relations, especially over the sweep of like the last 70 years, is to sort of view them either through the prism of Cold War competition between the U.S. and the then Soviet Union, or through another fateful triangle, which is, the U.S., India, Pakistan. And so I'm wondering why, if you sort of step back and think about it, why has the China angle been ignored, right? Why do you think it's a crucial prism that people may not have sort of quite identified?
I think some of it is because of, one of the things that I came to the conclusion, it might be because of the way, official documents are actually kept, or in what access we had to the documents when the early tranches of U.S. India books were written or analysis were done. These were the State Department papers. And there, India and Pakistan were clubbed together in some form of what is now the South and Central Asia Bureau. And people would look at those papers, and yes, the discussions there were about U.S. relations with India and Pakistan. Once we started getting access to White House papers, you get the broader view of how presidents and their staffs were seeing it, and they were taking this more expansive view. So I think some of it was because of the stovepiping in operational terms. I also wonder to some, and we, of course, didn't have any access to Indian papers at that time, so there was very little idea. And so I think some of it, when you're doing research, and, I had to be careful that I didn't get guilty of this, is you do start thinking of it from the prism. So a lot of these books were written in the 80s and 90s where, yes, the Soviet Union and Pakistan were the lenses through which they were seeing this relationship. And so I think they, looking back, that might have played a little bit of a role as well.
So you're a historian. You were trained as a historian. You did your PhD at UT Austin. And I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, thinking about a book of this sweep and scope where you're looking at U.S., India, China relations, this triad over 30 years, right, from 49 to 79. I mean, were you ever daunted by the prospect of describing, through the most powerful, biggest countries in the world over 3 decades?
So because I'm not a typical historian, I've been trained as a historian, but I'm a little bit of a mutt. I've also done IR, done political science, was at a policy school. And plus, maybe I didn't know better. My initial, I remember, proposal was to do 60 years of this, and just realized during the course of kind of talking to people that would just be ridiculous. So that, find a kind of more manageable way and a way to tell a story that either I could do a part 2, but also could tell enough of a story that was reflective. And so, I chose this period kind of 1949 to 1979 because I think it reflects, in the Cold War, it reflected kind of, so 49 is when the People's Republic of China is established. Now, the book does start a little earlier when India gains independence and U.S.-India relations first develop. But what I do is 49 when the PRC is established to 79, when both the U.S. and India, having gone through various different phases of relations with China and seeing China either as a friend or foe, 79 is when both countries kind of essentially normalize relations with China. So I thought it came like, full circle at that point. And there are these various phases, which I'm sure we'll talk about, where U.S. and India relations in these different phases were different. They saw their perceptions of China were different, and how that perception and those perceptions affected U.S.-India relations were also different. So I try to tell a story where these phases are reflective of some broader themes. Yes, I think, even for the reason I said I'm not a typical historian, historians often don't take a 30-year sweep, particularly for these kind of projects, because they're so intensive in terms of archival work.
So the book is broken up into these sort of four phases of the U.S. India relationship between 49 and 79. And what I like about that is, it's these sort of four parts, and it's almost like you're watching this romantic relationship unfold and you're going through these different steps, right? So first you have divergence in the late 1940s and early 1950s. You then move very swiftly to convergence from about 1956 or so to 1962. Then you have the third phase called dependence and disillusionment, a phase I'm all too familiar with, between 1962 and 1968. And then finally, the story ends with sort of disengagement in the 1970s. Let's kind of go through these quickly, but starting with the 1940s, you have this line that I really like, and I want to just read it out, where you say, quote, "Apathy towards India was widespread in Congress and among the public, as well as within much of the administration. In some sections, there was downright antipathy." And you conclude from that both President Truman and his Secretary of State Acheson, given everything else they had to deal with at the time, had basically zero appetite either to take on the apathy or the antipathy. Why not?
So I hadn't, by the way, Milan, thought about the romantic kind of progression of that, of the relationship.
I mean, it gets happier once you go after
That's right.
the 1980s.
There's a kind of a reunion.
Yeah, that's part two. That's part two. That's book two.
That's right. But it is funny because people told me that, if you're going to name a book Fateful Triangle, it sounds like a romance novel. And somebody else told me there was a Noam Chomsky book called Fateful Triangle. And I said, well, if people buy the book accidentally thinking it's a romance novel or a Chomsky book, I'd be more than happy.
Right.
But going back kind of to the beginning, in some ways, this was a frustrated romance at the start. Truman and Acheson actually had this brief moment of hope for India in 1949. When Prime Minister Nehru first comes to the U.S., they had hoped that, having lost China, as they put it, that India could be this kind of play this role in Asia as a democratic contrast and strategic counterbalance eventually to China, and that they had hoped that they to ensure this they would shower India with assistance. But what they find very quickly is that while Prime Minister Nehru had some concerns about China down the line in the future, he actually saw China somewhat differently and how to approach it differently. And this is what plays out in that first phase between kind of India and the U.S., where Nehru tries to convince the Truman administration that, look, China might be a challenge, but if we engage it rather than contain it, we can help make it a responsible stakeholder. We can help create a wedge between China and the Soviet Union. And whereas, the U.S. administration saw China very much as part of its Soviet problem, as a junior partner, and they saw the communist threat as a monolith. Now, these differences wouldn't necessarily have made a difference, but they did contribute to that sense of antipathy and apathy that you started with, because they played out in terms of differences on whether to recognize the People's Republic of China. India did, the U.S. did not. What to do about the Chinese takeover of Tibet. The U.S. wanted India to do more to prevent it. India said, we don't have the resources. And especially over the Korean War, when you really see antipathy in India towards India in the U.S. develop, because during the Korean War, India was playing this intermediary role, trying to serve as a channel between the U.S. and China. It ends up getting people in the U.S. thinking that India is actually siding with China. And so you have antipathy, which then turns into an opposition to aiding India, which then creates resentment in India. And the apathy is because at that point, with India having said, we don't want to play this role that the U.S. want us to play in Asia as this non-communist power, and we don't want to ally with you. The Truman administration says, well, then you don't have any utility for us. So why are we going to bother when we have so much else going on? Why are we going to bother to go to the Hill and try to get aid for you? You're actually part of the problem. During the course of not just the Truman administration, but the first Eisenhower administration, this is essentially what plays out, which is there's this kind of sense of frustration. India thinks a lot of these U.S. developments and kind of containment strategy towards even China and the Soviets in Asia are part of its problem. It wants peace and stability in the region. And to try to ensure that, it actually tries to develop a relationship with China. And we saw that in the form of the Panchsheel Treaty of 1954.
So things start to change in the 1950s, particularly in the middle half of the decade. And by the time Nehru travels to America, I think this is 1956, there was greater convergence, you document this, than ever before in terms of how Washington and Delhi viewed Asia and one another. So I'm curious, sort of, how did developments in China, or rather what developments in China sort of changed, both how Eisenhower on this end looked at things as well as Nehru on that end looked at things?
It's quite interesting how quickly things start to change, and they change about the same time in about 1956-57. You see kind of this confluence of conditions, but over this period from about 1956 to 1962, you see kind of and in these early years, you see not just both sides' perception of China as a challenge converge, but also their approach towards it, and particularly their agreement that part of the way to take on that China challenge that both of them started to perceive was a partnership with each other. And so for the Eisenhower administration, this is the point, like in the mid-50s, that they start in his second term, he starts to see the Cold War not just a geopolitical battle, but an economic one and an ideological one much more. And in this context, you couldn't, the uncommitted world, as they call it, the non-aligned world, was actually important. And you couldn't see Soviet-backed China particularly succeed economically, while democratic India, failed. Because for him, India was one of the largest dominoes in that domino theory. And if it fell, what kind of message would that send to the rest of the free world, as he'd put it? So I think, he starts to see the China as a, much more kind of the ideological challenge and economic challenge that the idea of China poses. Nehru, in the meanwhile, this is when you start to see the boundary dispute that exists to this day between China and India really come to the fore. It eventually kind of results in skirmishes by 1959, and eventually, obviously, the India-China war in 1962. But this makes Nehru see China as much more of a geopolitical challenge in a way he hadn't. He's also at this time quite concerned about Chinese inroads in Nepal. Again, something that we hear these days. But he's also thinking at this point about China as an ideological challenge. So it starts matching the U.S. because for him, it wasn't just the U.S. that this idea of a fateful race between China and India had taken on. It was also in India, where you saw Prime Minister Nehru and his government that was having some trouble with the economy really start to fear that if China next door, and this is around the time the Great Leap Forward was happening, but at that point everybody thought it was going to be a success, Nehru's concerned that, look, China is going to succeed, and communist China, and they'll deliver to their people, and India, this fledgling democratic government, will not be able to deliver to its people. And so Indians would start to say, what is this democracy thing? Is it really worthwhile? Should we go communist instead? And so you see this converging. What this convergence on threat perception of China ends up meaning a lot of American economic assistance to India, military assistance, especially during the 1962 war, and even after. But you also see kind of the U.S. and India start to engage on various subjects and, crucially, manage differences better because they needed each other for this broader thing. And this cooperation really kind of does culminate in U.S. assistance to India during the 1962 war in the terms of military equipment, but also discussions about potential kind of air defense assistance on the part of the U.S.
So within a couple of years, you get to the mid-1960s, things change once again. You write in one section, quote, that the mutual need kept the U.S. and India tethered to one another, but these bonds were fraying, end quote. And I'm wondering, this is exactly during the intensity or the pickup in the Vietnam War. What role did that war play in terms of creating new sources of friction or tension between the United States and India?
So this period is really interesting between kind of 1963 and 68. And, for the U.S., the Vietnam War is what is remembered as a crucial period of that time. But just to step back a bit, I mean, in the triangular perspective, what's going on during this period is still very much the U.S. and India seeing a role for each other in their China strategies. And so that means quite a lot of cooperation during this period of time, defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, strange expeditions going up to the Himalayas to put a nuclear-powered monitoring station to surveil the Chinese nuclear program. China did, the U.S. deterring China from entering the 1965 war on behalf of Pakistan, but also kind of an air defense agreement that was like in 63 that was a implicit security assurance from the U.S. to India in the case of another Chinese attack on India. But this is also the period, and I provide this context for the Vietnam experience, when you see the U.S. and India, while they still think China is a major threat, they start to disagree about what to do about it. Now, this is where Vietnam comes in. Some of India and the U.S.'s disagreement had to do with things like, how does India actually tackle the China threat? The U.S. said to India, you focus on development, strengthen yourself internally. We'll help on the defense side. India didn't wanted to spend more on defense. So some of it is a resource area. Another thing was, was Pakistan part of India's China solution, which the U.S. thought, or part of India's China problem, which Delhi thought. But this Vietnam aspect comes up because there's a sense for somebody like Johnson that he would say things like, I'm fighting their battle in Asia. Why can't they just, and by they he meant India, why can't they just do their bit? So, he ideally would have liked Indian support in Vietnam because he said, look, we share a threat. We're both concerned about China. And it's true. Even India agreed it did not want to see greater Chinese influence in Southeast Asia, and particularly in Vietnam. But for India, they saw the U.S. war as creating more space for the Chinese because it was bringing them in. And so they thought, not only is it creating space for the Chinese, it's actually distracting the U.S. from helping India. That those resources, instead of going into war, should be defending this broader idea. And that they saw, Ho Chi Minh as a nationalist more than a communist. Whereas the U.S. Thought that, okay, and Johnson would say, okay, you're not going to support me on Vietnam. Will you at least stop criticizing me on it? And particularly Indira Gandhi, by the time she becomes prime minister, and for somewhat domestic political reasons, she starts criticizing Johnson publicly. And despite the setbacks that India had had in the early and mid 60s, the Johnson administration still cared about what India said in the world, because in Asia and globally, India as that non-aligned voice still
that really mattered.
Yeah, that mattered. And here India was not supporting. So they didn't agree. They didn't disagree about the end goal in Vietnam when it came to Chinese influence. They wanted it out. They did disagree about what that would take.
Right. How do you sort of get from point A to point B?
Exactly.
So when you come to the end of your particular story, not the end of the U.S. India story, obviously, but the kind of mid part of the 1970s and beyond, you enter this period of disillusionment, as you call it, and you have this really nice quote of a American political counselor who I guess is based in Islamabad, who says, "We had a more or less neutral policy. Unfortunately, it got hung up with Kissinger and Nixon and their globaloney." And I have to ask you, what exactly is globaloney, and how did it upend some of the gains that had been made over this previous 20, 25 years on both sides?
So, the globaloney that he was talking about was in the context of the 1971 India-Pakistan war. And actually, even more broadly, what was then called the East Pakistan crisis, which is the whole year of 1971, the situation playing out in East Pakistan, their demands for autonomy, and West Pakistan not acceding to those demands, eventually resulting in a crackdown, a West Pakistani crackdown in what is now Bangladesh.
And beautifully captured in another book by Gary Bass on
yes,
the
though I would say, and not because it's at a Carnegie podcast, I think the book that I would suggest on 71 is Srinath Raghavan's 1971 in International History.
Ooh, that's going to cost me.
Well, it's a good way to it's the Brookings person suggesting Srinath's book. But, he talks about this kind of globaloney as well and lays it out because his book looks at how a lot of actors looked at this Bangladesh situation. And, what happened during this time is instead of seeing this as a crisis that was no doubt affected, and eventually this crisis leads to, millions of refugees coming into India, and then India supporting at least an insurgency, kind of a Bengali insurgency, Bangladeshi insurgency, eventually leading to the India-Pakistan war, and the creation of Bangladesh. So this is kind of the Cliff Notes version of this. It's a complex story. But where Nixon and Kissinger come in is they're seeing this, this is happening in the region. No doubt global influences and trends are playing a role in what is happening. But what Nixon and Kissinger do is they see what's happening there, not in the context of this is happening in South Asia. They see it in the context of their developing rapprochement with China, which is happening, which they're trying to play out, reach out to China through Pakistan during this period. And they're doing this China rapprochement because of the larger triangulation that they had planned out for between the U.S., China, and Soviet Union. So essentially what they were trying to do is engage with China and Soviet Union in a way, create a wedge, greater wedge between China and the Soviet Union, which had split by this point, to better their own kind of status and power in this triangular relationship because of Vietnam, because the end goal. So this is this huge kind of global thing. Vietnam War, want to get out of it, create triangulation between, get into a better space with China, Russia, start seeing essentially that prism as the prism through which to see this. And so that's the globaloni, which is instead of seeing this in the terms of, look, Pakistan, urging Pakistan and West Pakistan at that time, which was a U.S. partner, just saying, look, why don't you ease up, give them some autonomy. They won in the Awami League in the East Pakistan had won kind of a majority in the elections that were held. Essentially using pressure and persuasion to get Pakistan to accede to some demands. They actually backed Pakistan to the hills. And there's some speculation that had they not backed them, would Pakistan have gone as far as they had. So seeing this through the prism and where, this brings China in is this is when, because of this concern that if they didn't back, if the U.S. didn't back Pakistan during the 71 crisis, China would question their bona fides. They suddenly start to kind of also move away from India, which had thought it had this implicit security assurance. Indian officials ask Kissinger and Nixon, try to suss out, well, if China enters a potential war, India-Pakistan war, would you come and defend us? And, Kissinger essentially, tries to not say anything and then says, you might need to rely on others. To which India's answer is, okay. The Soviets had proposed this treaty in 1969. India had refused to sign it. But in 1971, they go ahead and sign it. So this globaloni comes full circle, where India also starts getting to be very much part of it. So
I want to move this conversation to where you go in the conclusion. And I found some of your key takeaways to be extremely interesting. And I want to start by asking you about India's commitment to this fabled doctrine of non-alignment. And you write in one place that non-alignment does not mean no alignment. And I sort of had to scratch my head and read that out a few times. And I'm still not sure I totally understand. So when you say non-alignment does not mean no alignment, help me out. What does that mean?
So it means that while India might not ally, it does align or tilt, or as Nehru used to call it, lean towards certain countries or blocs. And it has been known, we know of at least 2 instances in the period that I cover where it did this. With the U.S. In 1962 and then for a number of years after, and then with the Soviet Union in 1971, and then for, that lasted for about 16, 17 years. The argument I make in the book is that these 2 instances can tell us about the conditions under which India tilts. And it involves a few different elements. Those conditions are, one, that India perceives an imminent threat, a clear and present danger, essentially, or a challenge. Second, it comes to the conclusion it cannot tackle that challenge on its own. Third, its natural desire to maintain like multiple options in terms of partners, a diversified portfolio of partners, as I put it, is thwarted because there aren't multiple options available to partner with to tackle that challenge. And fourth, there is actually an option, a partner available that is interested in helping India deal with the challenge. Finally, the Indian political and bureaucratic leaders have the political capacity to actually make this tilt. And when these conditions exist, we've seen India align, tilt, or lean towards certain countries. And so, one of the things that I argue is we've actually seen, I think we're in a spot today where you can argue that India has yet again aligned with the US and its allies and partners because these conditions have been in place since the early 2000s, essentially.
Right. Aligned but not allied.
Yes,
That's
very
an important
important
distinction. I want to ask you about the very, very last line of the book, which goes something like this. Quote, as the history shows, alignment, referring here to between the U.S. and India, is neither impossible nor inevitable. Nature might bring the two countries together as they deal with China, but without nurture, any such alignment will be unsustainable. So I want to kind of bring this story full circle to the present moment. Are we seeing kind of nature and nurture come together? We're taping at this precise moment as President Trump has just concluded his visit to India. Are we finally kind of seeing the nature and the nurture sort of come together in a new and different way?
I think we have seen kind of nature and nurture, and it's been consistent, actually. It's been remarkably consistent with ups and downs, but over the last kind of decade and a half in particular, that we've seen nature, that is, the China challenge, bring these two countries together. And then the two countries actually, working to not just develop, but maintain kind of if not a consensus, at least cooperation on and discussions on aligning their approaches towards China. Having said that, and the reason I put it in that context is we have had these two views. You've had, I think, Ambassador Bob Blackwell was the one who put it, where he said in the mid-2000s, when the China appears as a challenge, the U.S. and India will naturally come together. But then you had, and this is often heard on so that, alliance is inevitable. Then you had people like Manmohan Singh, who's then Prime Minister, saying, that's impossible. India doesn't gang up on other countries, not just in terms of alliance, any grouping. Well, I think today we clearly do have groupings, whether it's U.S.-India partnership, whether it's a Quad, whether it's trilateral. But I think one thing to remember is convergence in China has definitely brought, and a lot of the nurture that they've put in, has brought the U.S. and India to this point. It has driven the strategic partnership. I argue it's even why President Trump even made it to India, why his administration officials were keen that he go. But at the end of the day, and why he received the welcome he received from Prime Minister Modi, but at the end of the day, we shouldn't assume that threat, kind of general threat of China alone, will keep the two countries together. Because the book argues that for the US and India to really kind of have a sustained alignment, it's necessary not just for a broad perception of threat, but that they agree on the nature of the challenge, the urgency of the challenge, and how to deal with the challenge.
And what to do about it.
Yeah.
And this is really the subject of a very nice op-ed, Tanvi, you've written in today's Financial Times, basically on this very subject, and we'll link to that in the episode summary. I want to just kind of tie this together with something else that actually came up during your book launch. I think you tweeted about it, but I also tweeted about it at the moment because it was such a kind of funny line. It was something that Kurt Campbell said. Kurt was a former top U.S. official who served at the State Department and the Defense Department, and he said, the most fascinating thing about working with your Indian friends and counterparts when it comes to China is that they will tell you exactly what they want you to say. And then you'll go out in public and you'll say it, and then they'll be like, I can't believe you said that. Don't talk like that. That's too, leaning forward. Why is India still so shy about accepting the logic that the China challenge plays in bringing the U.S. and India together, right? So in Washington, it's commonplace for all of us to talk about exactly what you've mentioned. But in India yet, we sort of have this, it's implicit but unsaid, and we sort of whisper it. Why is that?
So at the risk of getting myself into trouble, I'm going to go back to the romance analogy. It's the different way you do romance
this
in the
part
US
of the,
and
the
India.
courtship process?
The courtship process. Public displays of affection, less kind of popular in India than the US. But to be less flippant about it, I think India has not shied away from the logic of it. I think India is more shy about talking about it for the reason that they are, in terms of the China-India dynamic, unlike the China-US dynamic, they are the smaller power. They also live next door. And they don't, especially since as a country that doesn't have an alliance, you don't want to poke the dragon or the tiger, whatever you think of China as.
And they share an extensive, 2,500 mile or so
Yep.
border.
And I think, but it is one thing we know. While India might not use the C word, the China word, while they might not, mention it when in U.S. India statements, they do talk about it. I mean, as you mentioned, the 2,500 mile boundary. One of the things, a recent book by a couple of Washington Post journalists, there's this very memorable line that essentially says that President Trump doesn't know that China and India had a border, where he says in a meeting to Prime Minister Modi, allegedly, that it's not like you have a boundary or border with China. The part what's in the book that's missing in some of the articles is the context of that conversation, where Prime Minister Modi is essentially talking to President Trump about Chinese assertiveness and aggressiveness, and saying that we need to be concerned about the Belt and Road Initiative and others. And the reason, it's not just that they're discussing it. That book says that, after that, 2 years after that conversation in November 2017, U.S. India relations had a downturn. Well, that's where I'm afraid, this is where the book might not be quite accurate in that sense, in the sense that because India does accept the logic of the China-driven U.S.-India partnership, we have actually seen in the last 3 years, at least on the defense and security side, considerable progress, which maybe over time, because it's seen as separate, it's not as memorable. But if you actually put it together and had packaged it under a deal, it's the kind of thing you would call a big deal, of almost the nuclear deal virality.
So you may have annoyed some Indians with your PDA comments. So let's see if you can annoy some Americans. One of the interesting passages in your book recounts, I think it was Eisenhower's trip, where he was greeted like a king with a huge crowd. So whose crowd size was bigger? Donald Trump's 110,000 or so, or Dwight D. Eisenhower's?
So, to me, like the perfect Bollywood movie for this occasion, and the quote for this kind of trip, because of the discussion of audience size, is a movie that actually Trump mentioned in his speech, Sholay, where Gabbar Singh, asks one of his henchmen, who, kitne aadmi the, or for those who don't speak Hindi, how many people were there? At least, Trump acknowledged there were 125,000 people, a few thousand more. Eisenhower had more. There's little doubt. I think, there's some questions about how did you get, because the number that I quoted was the one that he used, but also the Secret Service at the time was 500,000 at his speech. With more with many more lining up as well. And it was interesting tweeting about it and having some folks who had been there as part of those crowds actually on Twitter talk about that experience. Maybe some of that is also, in those days, these things happen. Today, for security reasons, I'm not even sure you could do a trip like that. But yeah, Ike is, India liked Ike.
My guest on the show today is Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution. Her new book is called Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped U.S.-India Relations During the Cold War. It's out now, published by Brookings Institution Press. Tanvi, you've had your book launch here. What's your plan for India?
I'm hoping to do a book launch there in April, where the book is under the Penguin Random House banner.
Okay, so for those of our listeners who are in India, keep an eye out for that. Tanvi, thanks for joining us, and hope to see you back soon.
Thank you so much, Milan.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Megan Maxwell and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Lauren Dueck is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.